The Shrouded Figure. Hello friends, welcome to the horror ghost stories. The story begins. The small, quiet town of Marlow had always seemed peaceful, nestled between dense forests and rolling hills. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and strangers were as rare as snowfall in summer. But for as long as anyone could remember, there was an unspoken rule in Marlow: never venture out after dusk. It wasn't that the town was particularly dangerous, at least, not by the standards of most. The streets were well kept, the houses modest but comfortable. Yet there was an oppressive, unsettling air to Marlow as night approached. The reason wasn't so much the local superstitions or strange tales, but the peculiarities that had emerged over the years, odd occurrences that no one dared speak of openly. One of these peculiarities was the shrouded figure. The first sighting occurred when a local fisherman, Thomas Evers, was returning from a long day on the river. As he made his way through the woods near the edge of town, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A tall, dark figure draped in a tattered cloak, standing perfectly still under the pale light of the crescent moon. The figure's face was hidden beneath a hood, and its posture was unnaturally rigid. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. He'd written it off as his imagination, but the next morning, a child was found missing from the village. The disappearances continued, one after another. First it was the baker's daughter, then the postman's son, then a group of school children. Each time, they had been last seen walking alone at night, always in the direction of the woods. Every time, there were whispers just before they vanished: someone had seen the shrouded figure. But no one spoke of it aloud. In Marlow, to bring up the figure was to invite bad luck, to stir up things best left untouched. Still, everyone knew. The town was cursed. Amelia Cartwright, a recent arrival to Marlow, wasn't aware of the legends. She had moved to the town to escape the chaos of the city and find peace in a quieter life. She had rented a small cottage just on the outskirts, near the edge of the forest. The old woman who owned the property, Mrs. Hargrove, had warned her about the woods, but Amelia thought little of it. She had always enjoyed long walks and the quiet of nature, and nothing could have prepared her for the terror that would soon grip her new home. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amelia decided to take a walk through the woods. She had become fond of the solitude, the rustling of the leaves, and the smell of pine in the air. The sun set early that time of year, but she wasn't worried. Her phone was fully charged, and she figured she could get back before the night truly set in. The woods were dense, the trees towering above her, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that blocked out most of the remaining daylight. The further she walked, the more she felt a strange unease settle over her. It wasn't anything she could put her finger on, it was just a feeling, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like being watched. But she shook it off. It was just the quiet of the forest, she told herself. But then she saw it. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow in the distance, flickering like a candle in the wind. But no, there it was again. A figure, tall and thin, standing motionless between the trees. The figure was draped in a heavy cloak, its face hidden under the deep folds of a hood. It was too far away to make out any details, but Amelia felt a chill run through her. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned to leave, but something in the pit of her stomach told her she couldn't. The figure hadn't moved, but she could feel its presence, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. She forced herself to look away, to start walking in the opposite direction, but her feet felt as if they were stuck in the mud, dragging through the forest floor. The wind picked up, howling through the trees. The figure seemed to grow larger, its silhouette more distinct, its presence unmistakable. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she glanced over her shoulder. The figure was closer now, its dark form looming just beyond the trees. It wasn't walking. It was gliding, moving slowly but steadily toward her, its cloak billowing behind it like smoke. Desperation surged within her, and she turned, running through the woods with all the strength she could muster. Her breath was ragged, her legs burning as the branches scraped against her skin. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was chasing her. The faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her, too slow, too deliberate to be her own. She stumbled and fell, scraping her palms against the rough ground. When she looked up, the figure was standing over her. Her eyes locked with the shadow beneath the hood, and for a split second, she swore she saw eyes, deep, hollow eyes staring back at her from the darkness of the cloak. The world around her spun, her vision blurring as the figure's presence seemed to suffocate her. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. Amelia didn't stop to question it. She scrambled to her feet, heart hammering in her chest, and ran toward the cottage, her legs carrying her faster than she ever thought possible. When she burst through the door, slamming it shut behind her, the silence of the house felt deafening. The next morning, Amelia woke with the sun casting pale light through her bedroom window. She tried to shake off the feeling of dread that lingered from the night before, but it clung to her like a heavy fog. She decided to go into town and speak with Mrs. Hargrove. Surely, there must be an explanation for what had happened in the woods. When she arrived at the old woman's house, Mrs. Hargrove was waiting for her, as if expecting her. "You saw it, didn't you?" Mrs. Hargrove asked without preamble. Amelia nodded, her voice shaky. "The figure in the woods. What is it? What does it want?" Mrs. Hargrove's face grew somber. She gestured for Amelia to sit, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. "The shrouded figure has been here for a long time," she said quietly. "It's a curse. No one knows exactly where it came from or how it got here, but it feeds on fear. It lures people into the woods at night, drawing them closer with the promise of something familiar, a face they think they know, a voice they think they can trust. But those who get too close, they disappear." Amelia listened, her heart sinking with every word. "You see, every time someone vanishes in this town, the shrouded figure is there, watching. It waits for the perfect moment to strike, to claim another soul. And it will keep coming back, again and again, until the town is empty. Until no one is left." "But why?" Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why does it do this?" Mrs. Hargrove looked out the window, her eyes distant. "Some say it's a spirit, a vengeful spirit, angry at the world. Others believe it's something much older, a creature born from darkness, feeding on the lost and the forgotten. But no one knows for sure. All we know is that it will come for anyone who dares to enter the woods after dark." "Then how do we stop it?" Amelia asked desperately. "You can't stop it," Mrs. Hargrove replied gravely. "The only thing you can do is avoid the woods. Don't go out at night. Don't try to confront it, because it will make you its next victim. No one who has tried to fight it has ever returned. Amelia felt the weight of the words sink into her chest like lead. She couldn't stay in Marlow any longer. She had to leave, she had to escape the clutches of whatever was lurking in those woods. But that night, as she sat in her cottage, the wind howled outside. And then, just as she had begun to believe she was safe, the door creaked open on its own. The cold air rushed in, and there, standing just inside the threshold, was the shrouded figure. The cloak billowed in the wind, and the hooded face tilted slightly, as if studying her. Amelia froze, her breath catching in her throat. And in that moment, she understood there was no escape. The shrouded figure had come for her. And no one ever saw Amelia again. The next morning, the people of Marlow woke to a town shrouded in silence. It was the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, as if the very air had been sucked from the world. There were no birds chirping, no footsteps echoing down the cobbled streets. The fog that had rolled in overnight clung to the ground like a blanket, thick and suffocating. The town seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, waiting for what, no one could say. Amelia Cartwright had vanished without a trace, just like the others before her. No one knew how or why. Her cottage was untouched, the door still ajar when the morning sun barely pierced the fog. Inside, the only sign of her was a single, dark smudge on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. Mrs. Hargrove, the old woman who had warned her, was found on the outskirts of town, sitting on the steps of her cottage, her face pale and hollow, her eyes wide with terror. She muttered something to herself, her hands trembling as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper. The paper was filled with scribbled words, hastily written in a panicked scrawl. The shrouded figure is here. It's not just the woods. It's the town. It's coming for everyone. The villagers had heard the rumors, the whispered stories of the shrouded figure stalking the town, creeping closer with every passing night. But now, the figure had come for Amelia, and it seemed there would be no stopping it. The town's residents gathered in the square, faces drawn and anxious, not knowing what to do or where to turn. They had always kept to their routines, tried to ignore the strange disappearances, but now, the fear was undeniable. They could no longer pretend the figure was a myth or an old tale. It was real, and it was here. Jack Hensley, a former local constable who had moved away years ago but had returned recently after hearing about the strange happenings, stood at the center of the square. He was a man who had always believed in reason, in facts, in logic. But even he couldn't deny that something was terribly wrong with Marlow. He knew it wasn't just some isolated string of disappearances. There was something malignant in the town, something ancient, lurking just beneath the surface. "I'm not going to stand here and let this curse take us all," Jack said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "We need to find the truth. We need to confront this thing." The villagers looked at each other, uncertainty filling the air. But Jack's words stirred something in them, a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to fight back. "Maybe we could find where it comes from," Jack continued. "Maybe there's something in the old records, something we've missed. The townspeople who lived here before, the ones who disappeared, we can't ignore it anymore." A group of volunteers, led by Jack, set off to the town's old library, hoping to uncover something that would shed light on the shrouded figure. The library, like most things in Marlow, was forgotten and neglected, with dust gathering on the shelves, the smell of mildew heavy in the air. But the library held the town's history, all the records of those who had come before, everything that had been buried over the years. They searched through the musty tomes, flipping through yellowed pages of handwritten journals, old letters, and town meeting minutes. Hours passed, the only sound the rustling of paper and the occasional sigh of frustration. Then, Jack found something. It was a small, leather-bound journal tucked away in a forgotten corner, its pages nearly falling apart. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Durant, a former mayor of Marlow, and it seemed to chronicle the history of the town's earliest years. The entries were vague at first, speaking of a thriving community and the peaceful lives of its citizens. But as Jack read on, his heart sank. The later pages grew darker, filled with strange symbols and cryptic phrases. Elias wrote about a terrible event that had occurred many generations ago. A group of settlers had come to Marlow, bringing with them a powerful and ancient artifact, a cursed relic that had been passed down through their bloodline. The artifact was said to grant immortality, but at a great cost. It demanded a sacrifice, a life to keep it balanced, or the curse would spread. Elias described how the townspeople had tried to destroy the artifact when they realized what it was doing to them. But every time they tried, the figure would appear, a tall, shrouded figure who would take away the ones who dared challenge it. The figure's power had grown over time, its hunger insatiable. It had claimed countless souls, and the curse had continued to plague the town, its grip tightening with each passing year. Jack read aloud to the others. "It says here, the figure will never leave. It is bound to the town, bound to the land, and it will take those who are too curious, too brave to resist. It is the guardian of the artifact, the one who ensures the curse lives on." A shiver ran through the group. They had all heard the rumors, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all too real. The shrouded figure wasn't just an entity, it was a keeper of the curse, an enforcer who protected the artifact and ensured that no one would ever be free of its grip. As the group discussed their options, a deep rumble shook the ground beneath them, sending vibrations through the building. The windows rattled, and the sky outside darkened as clouds gathered quickly. It felt as if the town itself was holding its breath. Jack's heart raced. "It's here." The air in the library grew colder, and the lights flickered out. The oppressive stillness of the town seemed to echo through the building, like the calm before a storm. And then, a shadow crossed the doorway. The shrouded figure had arrived. At first, the figure was nothing more than a dark silhouette, standing motionless at the threshold. Then, slowly, it stepped forward, its cloak flowing around it like smoke, its face hidden in the deep folds of its hood. The coldness in the room intensified, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Jack tried to steady his breathing, reaching for a weapon, but his hands trembled. He could feel the presence of the figure closing in, its dark energy pressing against him, suffocating the very air. The others stood frozen, unable to move or speak. The shrouded figure raised its hand, pointing toward them. Its voice, low and hollow, filled the room. "You dare to seek what was never meant to be found." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He felt an unbearable weight press down on him, as though the figure's very presence was draining the life from him. "You cannot break the curse," the figure continued, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "You are bound to it, as the town is bound to the land. You will all be claimed. With a sudden movement, the figure's arm shot out, and the room was plunged into darkness. The sound of footsteps echoed, sharp and quick, like the tapping of bones on stone. And then, all at once, the room fell silent. When the lights flickered back on, the group was gone. Vanished. The library was empty, save for the journal Jack had found. And the shrouded figure, it, too, was gone. Marlowe was never the same after that night. The townspeople were left to wonder if anyone truly escaped the curse, or if the shrouded figure still walked among them, watching, waiting. The town's once lively streets became empty, abandoned by the very people who had once called it home. And somewhere, deep in the woods, the figure still stands, waiting for the next to wander too close, for the next curious soul to uncover the truth. Because the curse never ends. And it always claims what it is due. The end.